Watch the footage. November 24th, 1954. Waterloo Station, London. The Queen Mother steps off the train after her tour of the United States and Canada. She's elegant in her traveling clothes, smiling that smile that charmed 2 continents. And there on the platform stands her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Philip beside her, and 2 small figures, Prince Charles, who turned 6 just 10 days earlier, Princess Anne, 4 years old. Now watch what happens next. The Queen Mother doesn't simply greet the children. She bends down, brings herself to their level. And then she does something you almost never see in royal footage from this era. She gathers both children into her arms, pulls them close. A real embrace. Warm, tight. The kind of hug that says, "I missed you." The Queen stands nearby, formal posture, proper position, watching. She doesn't join in. That hug doesn't come from her. And if you've ever wondered why Charles spent his life searching for something he couldn't name, why he made the choices he made, loved who he loved, needed what he needed, this moment at Waterloo Station tells you more than any biography ever could. The children noticed who hugged them. They always notice. Before we can understand what that embrace meant to a 6-year-old Charles, we need to understand who was giving it. Because the Queen Mother wasn't simply a sweet grandmother in pearls. She was something far more complicated and far more formidable. In the summer of 1940, with German bombs falling on London and the British government urging the royal family to evacuate to Canada, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, then queen consort to the stammering king she'd married when he was still a second son nobody expected to need, made a decision that would define her for the rest of her long life. She refused to go. When advisors suggested that at least the young princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, should be sent abroad for safety, she delivered a statement that was recorded and published in newspapers across Britain. "The children won't go without me. I won't leave the king, and the king will never leave." 3 sentences. Steel underneath the velvet. Buckingham Palace was struck by German bombs 9 times during the war. 9 times. The most significant attack came on September 13, 1940, when a German bomber flew directly up the Mall in broad daylight, and released its payload on the palace quadrangle while the king and queen were in residence. The royal chapel was destroyed, windows shattered throughout the building. Her response to nearly being killed? "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." The East End had been devastated, entire streets reduced to rubble, thousands homeless. And here was the Queen Consort saying she was grateful her home had been bombed too, because now she shared something with the people suffering most. She reportedly practiced firing a pistol at targets in the gardens of Buckingham Palace, preparing herself for invasion, just in case. Whether Adolf Hitler actually called her the most dangerous woman in Europe remains unverified. The quote appears everywhere but lacks a primary source from German archives. What can be verified is that German propaganda targeted her specifically, mocked her hats, her smile, which tells you they noticed her. They worried about her, about what she represented. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, she stood on the Buckingham Palace balcony alongside the King, Winston Churchill, and her 2 daughters as crowds filled the mall and spilled into surrounding streets. Contemporary newsreel footage shows those crowds calling specifically for her, chanting for the Queen to come forward again and again. So when this woman bent down on a train platform in 1954 and pulled her grandchildren into her arms, she wasn't just being a soft, indulgent grandmother playing to cameras. This was someone who had demonstrated physical courage under sustained bombardment and chosen to remain when she could have fled to safety. The warmth was real, but so was the steel behind it. To understand why that hug mattered so much, why the absence of one from his mother might have shaped everything that followed, you need to know what Charles had already experienced by age 6. He was born at Buckingham Palace on November 14, 1948, at 9:14 in the evening, 7 pounds 6 ounces. His mother, Princess Elizabeth, was 22. His father, Prince Philip, had been playing squash in the palace when informed of the birth and reportedly bounded up the stairs to see his son. From the beginning, Charles's care followed the standard pattern for royal children, which meant it followed a pattern that would have seemed unremarkable to the British upper class, but bore no resemblance to how ordinary families lived. A nanny, Helen Lightbody, provided day-to-day care. An under-nanny, Mabel Anderson, assisted and would remain with the family for years, becoming a beloved figure in the children's lives. The nursery operated on a structured schedule. Princess Elizabeth visited at set times: morning after breakfast, evening before bedtime. Scheduled affection, rationed presence. Prince Philip was stationed in Malta with the Royal Navy for extended periods during 1949 to 1951, commanding first a frigate and then a destroyer. Princess Elizabeth spent time with him there when royal duties permitted, a period she would later describe as among the happiest of her life. During those Malta months, Charles remained in England in the care of nursery staff and his grandparents. His mother's absence began before he was old enough to understand why. His sister Anne arrived on August 15, 1950. Same arrangement, same nannies, same expectations of parental contact measured in brief daily visits rather than continuous presence. Then, on February 6, 1952, King George VI died at Sandringham House. His heart gave out in his sleep after years of declining health, exacerbated by heavy smoking. Princess Elizabeth was in Kenya at Treetops Hotel on the first leg of a Commonwealth tour when she received the news. She flew home as Queen Elizabeth II. She was 25 years old. Charles was 3 years and 3 months old. Anne was 18 months. Their grandmother, now styled Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, moved from Buckingham Palace to Clarence House, close enough to see the children regularly, close enough to provide what she could. Everything changed. And nothing changed, except the reason for his mother's distance now had a title and a crown attached to it. The separation that would mark Charles most profoundly began on November 23, 1953. Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip departed from London Airport for a Commonwealth tour covering 43,618 miles. Bermuda, Jamaica, Fiji, Tonga, New Zealand, Australia, the Cocos Islands, Ceylon, Aden, Uganda, Malta, Gibraltar. The most extensive royal tour ever undertaken, designed to strengthen Commonwealth bonds in the uncertain post-war world. Charles was 5 years old enough to understand that his mother and father were leaving, old enough to grasp that he would not see them for a very long time. Anne was 3, maybe too young to understand months as a concept, not too young to feel the absence. Neither child went with them. The official justification cited the length and demands of the tour, the constant travel, the formal events, the exhausting schedule that would take the royal couple from tropical heat to temperate cold and back again. The children stayed at Sandringham initially, then Buckingham Palace, in the care of nursery staff and their grandmother, always their grandmother. The separation lasted from late November 1953 until late April 1954, 174 days. That span included Christmas 1953, which Charles and Anne spent without their parents for the first time. It included Charles's 5th birthday on November 14th. It included 6 months of a small boy's life, during which direct communication with his parents was limited to letters that took days or weeks to cross oceans. No video calls, no daily phone conversations, no photographs texted across time zones. Transatlantic telephone calls were technically possible, but complex, expensive, and of poor quality. There's no documented evidence of regular phone contact, just letters and waiting. And a grandmother at Clarence's house who provided what continuity she could. The reunion happened at Tobruk, Libya, on April 27, 1954. Charles and Anne were flown out to meet their parents aboard the royal yacht Britannia, rather than waiting for them to return to Britain. Film footage exists of this moment on the yacht's deck. The Queen reportedly shook Charles's hand. Shook his hand. He was 5 years old. He hadn't seen his mother in nearly 6 months, and she shook his hand. The family sailed home together, arriving in Britain on May 15, 1954, when Britannia came up the Thames and the royal family disembarked at Westminster Pier to cheering crowds. But Charles had already learned something, whether he could articulate it or not. Some will say that's simply what monarchs did, that public displays of affection were considered inappropriate, that the Queen was raised the same way and knew no different. All of that is true, and none of it changes what a 5-year-old felt when his mother extended her hand instead of her arms. Jonathan Dimbleby's 1994 biography, authorized by Charles himself, based on extensive interviews and access to personal correspondence, documented what those early years were like from the inside. Dimbleby described Charles's childhood as emotionally difficult. He characterized the Queen as emotionally reserved in her interactions with her eldest son, Philip as demanding and sometimes dismissive. The home environment left Charles feeling isolated, misunderstood. These weren't Dimbleby's interpretations imposed on a reluctant subject. Charles authorized these characterizations for publication. This was his own account of his childhood, delivered through someone else's prose, because speaking it directly would have been impossible. The isolation deepened when Charles was sent to Gordonstoun. The school in northern Scotland had been Philip's school. He'd thrived there, become head boy, found the rigorous outdoor education suited his temperament perfectly. Philip wanted the same for his son. Charles did not want the same for himself. He was sent anyway. Charles was miserable. This is documented fact, not interpretation. He was unhappy among peers who didn't accept him. Being heir to the throne doesn't make you popular with teenage boys. It makes you a target. The Spartan conditions, the cold showers, the emphasis on physical toughness over intellectual cultivation, none of it suited a sensitive boy who preferred painting and music to rugby. But here's what mattered. The Queen Mother wrote to him. William Shawcross, in his 2009 authorized biography of the Queen Mother, documented her correspondence with Charles during the Gordonstoun years. She wrote consistently, supportively. When he needed someone to tell him he wasn't alone, she was there. Not performing for cameras. There were no cameras in the mail. Just letters to a lonely grandson who needed to know someone understood. Hugo Vickers, in his 2005 biography, described her warmth with grandchildren as a defining characteristic. She provided a refuge of affection in a household organized around duty. Clarence's house became a place Charles could go and simply be himself. Not the heir, not the future king, just a grandson being loved by a grandmother who had time for him. The Queen's schedule didn't permit that kind of availability. The Queen Mother's did. She made sure it did. July 1st, 1969. Carnarvon Castle, Wales. Charles was 20 years old. The ceremony that day would formally invest him as Prince of Wales, a title he'd technically held since he was 3, but which now became official, public, weighted with expectation. The castle had been prepared for weeks. Thousands gathered inside the walls, millions more watched on television. The BBC broadcast the ceremony to a global audience. Charles knelt before his mother as she placed the coronet on his head, clasped the sword around his waist, slid the gold ring onto his finger. Watch the footage of that moment. The Queen performs the ceremony with precision, every gesture correct, every word spoken clearly. She is doing her duty, and she does it perfectly. But watch Charles's face, 20 years old, bearing the weight of history, kneeling before his mother in front of the world, looking for something. The Queen Mother was there, of course, watching from her place in the stands, dressed immaculately, smiling that smile. After the ceremony, photographs show the family gathered, and in those photographs, you can trace the same dynamic that played out at Waterloo Station 15 years earlier. The Queen maintaining proper royal distance, the Queen Mother somehow always closer. A hand on an arm, a look of genuine warmth. Charles had just become Prince of Wales. He was also still a young man who knew which family member would hold him if he needed holding. Sometime in 1970 or 1971, the exact date depends on whose account you trust, Charles met Camilla Shand at a polo match. She was confident, funny, warm. She didn't treat him like the heir to the throne. She treated him like a person. They dated. By most accounts, he fell in love with her. But Charles left for naval service. Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles in 1973. The timing wasn't right. The circumstances weren't right. And perhaps Charles wasn't ready to fight for what he wanted. He'd never been taught that what he wanted mattered. Through the 1970s, as Charles approached 30, pressure mounted for him to marry. An heir to the throne needs an heir of his own. The search for a suitable bride became a national preoccupation, tabloids tracking every woman he was seen with, speculation running wild. The Queen Mother watched all of this unfold from Clarence's house. She understood something about duty and marriage. She'd been Queen Consort, after all, thrust into the role by her brother-in-law's abdication. She knew what the crown demanded, but she also knew her grandson, knew what he needed emotionally, and perhaps understood, watching him cycle through eligible women without finding whatever he was looking for, that what he needed wasn't what duty would provide. July 29th, 1981, St. Paul's Cathedral, London. Charles married Lady Diana Spencer. He was 32. She was 20. The global television audience reached an estimated 750 million people. Diana's dress had a 25-foot train. The ceremony was everything a royal wedding should be, pageantry and tradition, and a beautiful young bride and the heir to the throne looking, for that moment, like something out of a fairy tale. Watch the footage carefully, though. Watch Charles's face during the vows. Watch Diana's face when they emerge onto the balcony. Watch the body language in the carriage afterward. Something was off, even then. Even on the day designed to be perfect. The Queen Mother was there, seated in the cathedral, dressed in her signature pale blue. She'd been present at the wedding of Charles's parents in 1947. Now she was present at his. 3 generations of royal marriages. She understood what was being undertaken, and what it cost. Whether she knew about Camilla by then, knew that Charles had loved someone else before Diana and might still love her, is unclear. What's clear is that over the next decade, as Charles and Diana's marriage disintegrated in slow-motion public agony, the Queen Mother's home at Clarence's house became one of the few places Charles could escape. The 1980s and early 1990s were brutal. Charles and Diana's marriage, which had never been solid, cracked and then shattered. Both had affairs. Both gave devastating interviews. The press covered every fracture with gleeful cruelty. Diana mastered the media game, winning public sympathy. Charles was cast as cold, distant, the villain of the piece. Sound familiar? Cold, distant. The words that had been used to describe his mother's parenting were now being used to describe him as a husband. Cycles repeat. During this period, accounts from royal insiders describe Charles retreating to Clarence House, to the Queen Mother. She was in her 80s by then, but still sharp, still warm, still the person who'd hugged him at Waterloo Station when he was 6. She didn't judge. She didn't lecture. She provided what she'd always provided: presence, warmth, acceptance. A cup of tea and conversation about painting or horses or anything other than the tabloid nightmare consuming his life. The Queen, by contrast, was dealing with the institutional crisis. The monarchy's reputation was suffering. Something had to be done. Duty demanded action. The Queen Mother offered refuge. Different roles, same dynamic, same absence and presence that Charles had known since childhood. There's a counter-argument, of course. There always is. Some saw the Queen Mother's warmth as calculated, a performance for cameras. She did, by all accounts, enjoy being the center of attention. She understood image management before that phrase existed. Every wave, every smile, every perfectly timed embrace could be read as public relations rather than genuine affection. But here's what the skeptics miss. The pattern was too consistent. The evidence spans too many years. Private letters to a miserable teenager at Gordonston, refuge offered during a marriage falling apart, presence maintained decade after decade without cameras present. Photographs from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s tell the same story. The Queen Mother holding Charles's hand as they walked together, sitting close with her arm around his shoulders, embracing him at family gatherings. Compare those images to photographs from the same periods showing the Queen with her children. Different posture, different distance, bodies rarely touching. This wasn't performance. Performance requires an audience. The Queen Mother's warmth was evident when no one was watching, too. August 31st, 1997, Paris. Diana was killed in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. She was 36 years old. The news reached Balmoral Castle in Scotland, where the royal family was spending the summer. Charles was there, William, 15, Harry, 12. The Queen, Prince Philip, and the Queen Mother, 97 years old, who had come for her annual summer stay. Charles flew to Paris to bring Diana's body home. He made that journey alone, and when he returned to Balmoral, to the sons who had just lost their mother, to the family that had to figure out how to respond to a tragedy that was also a public relations catastrophe, the Queen Mother was there. What she said to Charles during those terrible days hasn't been made public, but she was there. She was always there. That was the point. That was always the point. The week that followed was chaos. The public wanted the Queen to return to London, wanted flags at half-staff, wanted visible grief from a family trained never to show it. The Queen eventually gave a live television address, one of the most significant of her reign, navigating between institutional formality and genuine human loss. Through it all, Charles had to be father and ex-husband and future king and grieving man all at once. And through it all, his grandmother, the woman who'd hugged him at Waterloo when his mother stood at the proper distance, was at Balmoral, providing what she could. The same thing she'd always provided: presence when duty demanded distance from everyone else. The argument some psychologists and royal biographers have made, and this is interpretation, not fact, but interpretation grounded in documented patterns, is that Charles spent his adult life seeking the maternal warmth he never received from his mother. That Camilla Parker Bowles provided something Diana couldn't. Not because Diana was deficient, but because what Charles needed wasn't a fairy tale princess. It was someone who felt safe, nurturing, emotionally present in the way his grandmother had been. This framing has appeared in various biographies and psychological analyses of Charles's romantic choices. The idea that he sought a mother figure, that his relationship with Camilla was less about passion and more about finally finding the emotional shelter he'd been denied as a child. Whether you accept that interpretation or not, the timeline is suggestive. Charles met Camilla before Diana, loved her before Diana, returned to her after Diana, and married her, eventually, on April 9th, 2005. After decades of complications, after Diana's death, after public opinion slowly shifted enough to make it possible. Something about Camilla provided what he needed, and maybe, just maybe, what he needed was shaped by what he didn't get. By a mother who shook his hand when he was 5. By the knowledge that warmth, when it came from his grandmother, never from the Queen. This isn't an attack on Elizabeth II. It's something sadder than that. She was raised the same way she raised her children. Her own parents, George VI and the Queen Mother, had maintained a certain distance. Nannies and nurseries and scheduled visits. That's what royalty did. Emotional reserve was bred into her bones. The role demanded distance. A queen cannot gather her children into her arms on a public platform because a queen must always be queen first, mother second. That is what duty cost. But here's the bitter irony. The Queen Mother, the woman who raised Elizabeth II with that same aristocratic distance, the same nannies and schedules and formal arrangements, became the grandmother who bent down to hug Charles and Anne, who wrote letters to Gordonston, who opened her home when her grandson's life fell apart. She gave her grandchildren something she hadn't given her daughters, or couldn't give them. The crown changed everything. Elizabeth became queen at 25, and the queen couldn't be what the grandmother could. Maybe that's guilt. Maybe that's wisdom that came with age. Maybe that's simply the difference between being a mother to a monarch and being a grandmother to children who desperately needed someone to hold them. Whatever the reason, the pattern held for 50 years. Grandmother warm, mother distant, children noticing. The Queen Mother died on March 30th, 2002, at Royal Lodge, Windsor. She was 101 years old. Queen Elizabeth II was at her bedside. 7 weeks earlier, Princess Margaret had died, also at age 71, after years of declining health. The Queen Mother had outlived her younger daughter. She had outlived her husband by 50 years. She had seen the empire she'd known as a young bride transform into the Commonwealth, watched television replace newsreels, witnessed Diana's death, and the public reckoning it forced upon the family she'd loved and served for 8 decades. Her funeral was held at Westminster Abbey on April 9th, 2002. Charles was 53 years old, and his grief was visible in a way that surprised observers accustomed to royal composure. His voice caught as he spoke of what she had meant to him. Press observers noted it as remarkable. A man trained from birth to maintain control, breaking in public. He described her as a source of support and warmth throughout his life, using language that spoke of love given and received. He rarely employed such language when discussing other family relationships. Draw your own conclusions. Here is what the footage at Waterloo Station shows, stripped of interpretation. November 24th, 1954. The Queen Mother descends from the train. She greets her daughter and son-in-law with appropriate formality. Then she turns to the children. She bends down, brings herself to their level, gathers them to her. A hug. Warm, tight, real. The Queen stands nearby, formal posture. She does not join in. That's not opinion. That's what the film shows. The rest, what it meant, what it did to Charles, how it shaped the man he became, is interpretation layered over evidence. But some interpretations fit the evidence better than others. And when you watch a 6-year-old boy receive affection from his grandmother while his mother stands at the proper royal distance, and then you trace that boy's life forward, through the unhappy school years, through the pressured marriage, through the public humiliation, through the long decades of searching for something he couldn't name, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. Charles was 56 when his grandmother had been gone 3 years, 56 when he finally married Camilla, 56 when he got to have what he'd wanted since he was young. By then, he'd spent his entire life in the space between duty and desire. Raised by a mother who loved him, no one disputes that Elizabeth loved her children, but couldn't show it. Raised by a grandmother who showed it constantly, shaped by the gap between them. The Queen died on September 8, 2022, at Balmoral Castle. She was 96. Charles, at 73, became King Charles III. He is now the institution. The crown rests on his head. The duties that kept his mother at arm's length are now his duties. And somewhere in his memory is a train platform in 1954. A grandmother bending down, arms opening. A hug that his mother didn't give. The children always notice. They notice who reaches for them and who doesn't, who bends down to their level and who expects them to reach up, who provides warmth without condition and who provides presence on a schedule. Charles noticed and spent the rest of his life dealing with what he'd learned, that love, when it came from his grandmother. The woman who stayed in London during the Blitz, who walked through bomb rubble in heels and pearls, who said she was glad her home had been bombed because now she could look the East End in the face, who wrote letters to a miserable schoolboy, who opened her door when his marriage was falling apart, who was there, always there, when duty pulled everyone else away. Steel and velvet, courage and warmth. She gave Charles something his mother couldn't give, whether that was because Elizabeth was cold or because the crown demanded coldness, whether she failed him or was failed by an institution that made motherhood impossible. The result was the same. An absence shaped him, a presence tried to fill it. And on November 24, 1954, at Waterloo Station, the cameras captured the whole dynamic in a single frame. Grandmother embracing, mother watching, children receiving love from the person offering it. This is what duty cost. Not just the Queen, not just the crown. A little boy who learned, before he could articulate it, that some people hold you close and some people stand at the proper distance. He's been navigating that lesson ever since. Subscribe for more stories like this.